They say the kitchen is a place of passion, a space where heat, pressure, and precision create something unforgettable. But for me, it became a place of temptation. As a head chef, I was used to control. Every dish, every order, every movement in my kitchen was dictated by my hands. My life was perfectly measured, like a carefully crafted recipe. Until he arrived. A new employee, young, ambitious, and dangerously charming. The way he moved, the way his eyes lingered on me a little too long, it awakened something in me that I had buried for years. But there was a problem. I was married. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, every night in that kitchen, the tension grew thicker. Until, one day, I realized he wasn't just good at cooking. In the kitchen, he did something even better with me. This is a story about desire, secrets, and the kind of temptation you can't resist. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more deep, emotional, and captivating stories like this one. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air as I stood over the stove, stirring a rich, simmering sauce. The kitchen was alive with movement, pans sizzling, knives chopping, voices calling out orders in a carefully orchestrated chaos. This was my world. I had spent years building my reputation, perfecting every dish, commanding my kitchen with precision. I was in control here, at least, I had been, until he walked in. "Chef, this is the new hire," one of my sous chefs, Marco, announced as he stepped aside, revealing the young man standing behind him. My grip on the wooden spoon tightened slightly as my eyes met his. Nico. That was the name printed on his apron. He was young, no more than his early 20s. Tall, lean, with dark, slightly messy hair and warm brown eyes that seemed to hold something I couldn't quite place. He wore the standard white uniform, but even in that simple attire, he stood out. Something about the way he carried himself, confident but not arrogant, sent a flicker of something unsettling through me. I shouldn't have been looking at him like that. I cleared my throat. "Welcome to my kitchen," I said, keeping my voice even. "You've worked in a restaurant before?" Nico nodded. "Yes, chef. Small places, nothing like this." His voice was smooth, steady. He held my gaze, unflinching, and that made my stomach tighten. I turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce again, trying to focus on the task at hand. "We move fast here. Keep up and do exactly as you're told." "Yes, chef." I heard the slight smirk in his voice. I ignored it. The night rushed by in a blur of orders, heat, and movement. Nico worked the prep station, chopping vegetables, plating appetizers, and following instructions without hesitation. He was good. Too good for someone who claimed to have only worked in small places. "Where did you actually learn to cook?" I asked when I found myself next to him, watching as he effortlessly filleted a fish. He glanced up at me, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "My grandfather owned a restaurant. I spent most of my childhood in kitchens." I nodded, satisfied with the answer, and turned away, only to feel his eyes on me again. The weight of his gaze sent an uncomfortable warmth creeping up my neck. I wasn't used to this. The subtle tension, the way my mind kept drifting back to him when it should have been focused on my work. I was married, for God's sake. And yet, every time I looked at him, I wanted to know what he was thinking. By the time the last plate left the kitchen and the chaos finally settled, I felt exhausted, but restless. The staff started cleaning up, the usual post-service routine. I stayed back, finishing up paperwork in my office. The kitchen was mostly empty when I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up. Nico. He stood in the doorway, his sleeves rolled up, exposing his toned forearms. His apron was slightly undone, and a light sheen of sweat clung to his skin. "Long night," he said casually. I leaned back in my chair, trying to appear indifferent. "You handled yourself well." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I shouldn't have noticed that. Shouldn't have noticed the way he lingered, the way his fingers rested just a little too long on the countertop as he leaned against it. But I did. And then he said it. "You watch me a lot, Chef." The words sent a sharp jolt through my chest. My throat felt dry. I forced a chuckle. "I watch everyone in my kitchen." Nico tilted his head slightly, that unreadable expression back in his eyes. "Is that so?" The air between us shifted, thickened. I should have shut it down. Should have reminded him that I was his boss, that I was married. Instead, I held his gaze for just a second too long, a second too dangerous. His lips twitched, almost like he knew something I didn't. Then, with an infuriatingly slow movement, he pushed off the counter and turned toward the door. "Good night, Chef." And just like that, he was gone. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. This was a problem, and I had a feeling it was only just beginning. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The kitchen was still quiet, the air filled with the lingering scent of herbs and last night's work. I busied myself checking inventory, trying to push away the thoughts that had kept me up all night. Nico, the way he had looked at me before leaving, the way he had said, "You watch me a lot, Chef." I was overthinking it. That's what I told myself. It didn't matter how he had lingered, how his words had wrapped around me like a slow-burning flame. I was his boss. I was married. I had spent years building this life, keeping everything in perfect order. I wasn't about to let a new hire unravel it. But then, as if summoned by my thoughts, he walked in. Nico strolled into the kitchen, a towel slung over his shoulder, his uniform slightly wrinkled like he had just thrown it on. His dark hair was tousled, his skin still carrying the warmth of sleep. "Morning, Chef," he said, his voice too smooth for this early in the day. I cleared my throat, focusing on the inventory sheet in front of me. "You're early." He shrugged, moving toward the prep station. "Figured I'd get a head start." I nodded, forcing my eyes to stay on my work. "Good." Silence stretched between us as he began chopping vegetables. The rhythmic click of his knife against the board filled the space, steady, controlled, too controlled. I glanced up, only to catch him watching me through his lashes, the faintest smirk playing on his lips. I gripped the clipboard tighter. Damn him. As the day went on, the tension only grew. Orders piled up, and the kitchen turned into the usual whirlwind of movement and heat. I thrived in this chaos. It was where I was most in control, where everything had a place, a purpose. But today, Nico was everywhere. Every time I turned around, he was there, close, too close. Brushing past me as he reached for ingredients, his fingers grazing mine when he handed me a knife, the heat of his body near mine whenever we moved around each other. I told myself it was nothing, accidental. But then, he leaned in. I was plating a dish, focused, when his voice brushed against my ear. "You're tense, Chef." I froze. The warmth of his breath sent a sharp jolt through me. I could feel the weight of his presence just behind me, too damn close. "Move," I said, my voice tight. He didn't. Instead, he reached past me, his hand grazing my waist as he grabbed a pan from the stove. My pulse slammed against my ribs. It was intentional. He was testing me. I turned sharply, meeting his gaze. Steady, knowing. I opened my mouth, ready to say something, anything, to break whatever this was. But before I could, a voice cut through the air. "Nathan!" I snapped my head toward the entrance, and my stomach dropped. My husband stood in the doorway. I barely heard the clatter of pans as someone dropped a tray. Leo. His presence shouldn't have made me feel guilty, and yet, my breath caught in my throat. His blue eyes swept over the kitchen before landing on me, and he smiled. Surprise. Thought I'd stop by. I forced a smile, wiping my hands on my apron. Didn't expect you. His gaze softened. I missed you. I should have walked toward him, should have closed the space between us, but I didn't, because I could feel Nico watching. I didn't dare turn around, but I knew. Leo stepped closer, reaching for my arm. His touch was warm, familiar. I'll wait for you outside. I nodded, unable to form words. He left, and for a moment the kitchen felt unbearably small. Then I turned and met Nico's gaze. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. But his eyes held something different now, something that made my stomach clench. He knew. Knew what? That I was married? That Leo had just reminded me of the life I was supposed to be living? Or worse, that I had wanted Nico to keep standing close. My hands curled into fists. Get back to work. Nico didn't move. Not at first. Then he smirked. A slow, infuriating smirk. As you wish, chef. And just like that, he turned away. But the damage had been done. Because now, we both knew the truth. This wasn't in my head. And no matter how much I tried to fight it, I was losing. The moment Leo left, I felt the weight of my own silence pressing down on me. The kitchen roared back to life. Orders being called, pans clattering, flames rising over the stove. But my mind was stuck on one thing. Nico's smirk. It wasn't just confidence. It was confirmation. He knew what he was doing to me. And worse, he knew I wasn't stopping him. I avoided him for the rest of the night, keeping my distance, barking orders at anyone in my path. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I felt him. His presence. His eyes. The way he didn't say anything, but didn't have to. By the time service ended, I was exhausted. I retreated to my office, needing a moment to breathe, to remind myself who I was. Married, successful, in control. Then, a knock at the door. I didn't need to ask who it was. I already knew. Come in. The door opened slowly. Nico. He stepped inside, closing it behind him. I should have told him to leave, but I didn't. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He leaned against the desk, his fingers tracing the edge of a clipboard as if he had all the time in the world. Then, he looked at me. I don't think your husband likes me. My chest tightened. What? He smirked. He barely looked at me when he walked in. You think he could tell? I exhaled sharply. There's nothing to tell. Nico studied me, like he could hear the lie in my voice. Then he stepped closer. Not enough to touch, but enough to make my pulse spike. You sure about that, chef? I clenched my jaw. This isn't a game, Nico. He tilted his head slightly. Isn't it? Silence. A slow burning tension in the air. Then, before I could stop him, his fingers brushed my wrist. Barely there. But it wrecked me. I yanked my hand away, standing abruptly. This can't happen, I said, more to myself than to him. Nico watched me for a moment. Then, he smiled. Not cocky, not teasing, just knowing. Like he had already won. He turned, hand on the doorknob. Good night, chef. And just like that, he was gone. Leaving me standing there, breathless, shaking, and one step closer to disaster. I should have put an end to this, should have drawn the line, made it clear. But instead, I let the tension simmer, pretending I could control it. pretending that if I ignored it, it would go away. It didn't. It only got worse. Days passed, and every moment in the kitchen became unbearable. Nico didn't push, but he didn't have to. The way he looked at me, the way his fingers would graze mine when passing a plate, the way his voice dropped just a little lower when he spoke to me. It was like he was daring me. And the worst part? I wanted to take the dare. It happened after closing. The kitchen was empty, the air thick with the smell of spices, heat still lingering from the night's service. I stayed late, pretending I had things to do. So did he. I knew it the second I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. Didn't need to. He was too close. I could feel him before I even saw him. His breath, his warmth, then his voice. "Tell me to leave, chef." Silence. My hands tightened on the counter. "Tell me you don't want this." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. And then, his hand was on my waist. I inhaled sharply. His touch was firm, steady, testing. I should have stopped him. I didn't. Instead, I turned. And suddenly, we were face to face. His eyes burned into mine, waiting. My chest tightened. This was it. This was the moment. And then, the door slammed open. We jumped apart. Marco, standing in the doorway, eyes wide, realization hitting all at once. Shit. Marco stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes flicking between us, the realization sinking in fast. I felt the blood drain from my face. He knew. Nico stepped back slowly, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the tension rolling off him. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't afraid. I was. Marco's mouth opened, then closed. His hands curled into fists. "What the hell is this?" I forced my voice to stay calm. "It's nothing." Nico let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what I had just said. Marco narrowed his eyes. "Bullshit." My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't let this spiral out of control. Not here. Not now. I stepped forward, keeping my voice low. "Marco, listen." He raised a hand, cutting me off. "No, chef. You listen." He glanced at Nico, then back at me, anger flashing in his eyes. "Does Leo know?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My throat went dry. Marco scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Jesus, Nathan." I swallowed hard. This isn't... But I didn't even know how to finish that sentence. Because it was something. And now it wasn't a secret anymore. Marco stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Silence. Nico exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. Well, that was dramatic. I shot him a sharp look. This isn't a joke. I'm not laughing. I turned away, bracing myself against the counter. I had messed up, big time, and Nico, he wasn't helping. I turned back to face him. "You don't get it." He lifted a brow. "Don't I?" I gritted my teeth. "I'm married." His gaze didn't waver. And yet, here we are. That was the problem. Here we were. Still standing in this kitchen, still in this moment, still unable to walk away from something that should have never started. Nico stepped closer. "Are you going to tell him?" My stomach twisted. "It's not that simple." He nodded, like he had expected that answer. "It never is." His voice was softer now, almost understanding. I hated that, because it made me want to lean into him even more, and that was exactly why I needed to end this. Right now. I straightened, exhaling sharply. This can't happen again. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Hurt? No. Frustration. He looked at me for a long moment, then scoffed. You say that like it was just me. I opened my mouth, but he wasn't finished. I didn't kiss you, Chef. His voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. You turned to me. You let me touch you. I clenched my jaw. It was a mistake. His lips twitched, but there was no amusement this time. Just something colder. Right. He nodded slowly, stepping back. A mistake. He said it like he didn't believe a single word. Neither did I. By the time I got home that night, Leo was already asleep. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching him. His breathing was slow, even, peaceful. And I hadn't felt peace in weeks. I ran a hand through my hair, my chest tight with guilt. I should tell him. I should fix this before it got worse. But instead, I just stood there, a coward in my own home. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not even close. I barely slept. By morning, my head pounded with the weight of everything. Leo, Nico, Marco. The mess I had made. At work, Marco barely looked at me. I could feel his disappointment in every clipped response, every sharp movement. Nico? He acted like nothing had happened. He worked, moved, spoke as if I didn't exist. And somehow, that hurt more than anything. By the time the kitchen cleared out, I stayed behind, staring at the empty space where Nico had stood hours earlier. Then, the door creaked open. Footsteps. I turned. Leo. My stomach dropped. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning my face. Then, in a voice too calm, he asked, Is there something you need to tell me? My heart stopped.